Your country is not real. Not in the way a mountain is real or a river is real. There is no atom of France you could point to under a microscope. It is an idea that several million strangers agreed to believe at the same time, and somehow that idea can send people to war and put you in prison. So how did humans convince each other that imaginary lines were worth dying for? Let's start at the beginning. For roughly 290,000 of the 300,000 years modern humans have existed, there were no countries, no passports, no borders, no such thing as illegal ground. There were bands of maybe 30 to 150 people, everyone knew everyone by face and by name, and territory worked the way it works for wolves. You knew roughly where your group hunted and roughly where the next group's hunting ground began, and the line between them was fuzzy, negotiable, and enforced by relationships, not paperwork. That is not a country. That is a neighborhood with teeth. So what changed? Farming changed it. Around 10,000 years ago, in places like the Fertile Crescent, humans stopped following food and started growing it. And the moment you plant a field, something happens to your relationship with land that never happened before. A hunting ground is something you use. A field is something you own. You put months of labor into a specific patch of dirt, and if a stranger walks onto it and starts eating your harvest, that is no longer an abstract territorial dispute. That is theft of your survival. Ownership was born the same day agriculture was, and ownership needed defending, which meant humans needed to know precisely where mine ended and theirs began. The archaeological record backs this up in an unglamorous but telling way. Some of the oldest boundary markers ever found are simple stacked stones and ditches surrounding early Mesopotamian farmland, dating back over 6,000 years. Not monuments, not palaces, rock piles. Humanity's first legal documents were piles of rock that meant, in effect, stop here. But a rock pile is not a country either. A rock pile protects a field. A country protects an identity. Something else had to happen for "this is my land" to become "this is my nation." That something was the city-state. By around 3100 BCE in Sumer, farming villages had grown dense enough and rich enough to need organization, irrigation systems, grain storage, defense, law. Cities like Uruk and Ur emerged, each with its own king, its own gods, its own army, and critically, its own name that people used to describe themselves. You weren't just a farmer anymore, you were a citizen of Uruk, and that meant something different than being a citizen of Ur. Even though the two cities were built by people who looked the same, spoke almost the same language, and worshipped overlapping gods. The line between them was not natural. It was administrative, and people were willing to kill and die over it anyway. Here's where most explanations of countries fall apart. People assume nations grew out of shared ethnicity, that humans naturally clustered with their own kind, and borders just formalized what was already true. That is mostly backwards. Ethnic and national identity, in most of history, followed the border, not the other way around. Rome did not conquer people because they were already Roman. Rome conquered people, and then, over generations, made them Roman, through language, law, roads, citizenship, and a shared story about what Rome was. The border came first. The identity was manufactured to fill it. This pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. The Qin dynasty unified 7 warring Chinese states in 221 BCE, not because the people of those states already thought of themselves as one people, but because Qin Shi Huang standardized their writing, their currency, their roads, and their laws, and forced a shared identity onto populations that had been killing each other for centuries. He built the first version of the Great Wall not just to keep nomadic groups out, but to draw, physically in stone, where China stopped being a debatable concept and started being a place with an edge. For most of history after that, the border was fuzzy again. Empires had cores and frontiers, not lines. A Roman province faded into barbarian territory over hundreds of miles, not one specific fence post. The idea of a precise agreed-upon line separating one sovereign nation from another, the kind you'd see on a modern map, is much younger than people assume. That idea has a birth date, 1648. The Peace of Westphalia, a set of treaties signed in Europe to end decades of catastrophic religious war, established a principle that sounds obvious now and was radical then. Every state has defined territory, and within that territory, its ruler's authority is absolute, and no other state gets to interfere. That is the modern nation-state. Not a tribe, not an empire, not a city defended by rock piles. A legally recognized box on a map with a government inside it that answers to no one else. Westphalia did not invent the nation-state everywhere at once. It planted the template that would spread, get exported through colonization, get imposed on populations who never asked for it, and eventually get copied by nearly every government on Earth. And that exporting is where the story turns genuinely strange. Many of today's 195 countries did not emerge organically from a shared people settling shared land. They were drawn by outsiders with rulers and pens. In 1884, European powers sat in Berlin and carved up an entire continent's worth of African territory into colonial borders, in rooms thousands of miles from the land they were dividing, frequently ignoring existing ethnic, linguistic, and tribal boundaries entirely. Straight lines cutting through the Sahara. Rivers used as borders because they were easy to find on a map, not because they made sense to the people living on both banks. Decades later, when colonial rule ended, those artificial lines did not disappear. They became the outlines of new, independent nations. Because by then, the border was the only shared thing millions of people inside it had in common. The identity, once again, followed the line instead of creating it. So the honest answer to how humans invented countries is this: they didn't invent them all at once, and they didn't invent them because people naturally sort themselves into nations. Countries are the accumulated residue of 5 separate human inventions, stacked on top of each other over 10,000 years. Ownership, invented by farmers defending fields. Citizenship, invented by cities needing loyalty. Bureaucracy, invented by empires needing to govern people they'd never met. Fixed sovereign borders, invented by European treaty writers trying to stop a war. And exported administrative lines, invented by colonial mapmakers who had never set foot on the land they were dividing. None of it was inevitable. None of it reflects some deep biological truth about humans needing nations the way we need food or sleep. For 97% of our species' existence, we lived without a single one, and we survived just fine. Tonight, somewhere on Earth, a person will be stopped at a checkpoint and asked to prove which side of an invisible line they were born on. The paper they hand over will decide where they're allowed to sleep tonight, what language their children are taught in, whether they can vote, whether they can be drafted, whether they can leave. And none of that paper describes anything physical. No mountain range changes, no river moves. The ground underneath that checkpoint is identical dirt on both sides. Countries are not written into human nature. They're written into human agreement. An agreement so old, so deeply inherited, and so universally reinforced that it now feels less like an idea and more like gravity. But it isn't gravity. It's just a story enough people agreed to believe at the same time, backed by enough soldiers to make the story feel true. And like every story humans have ever told themselves, it had a first telling. It just happened to be one nobody wrote down.